At noon on an October day in AD 52, an enormous man-made lake shimmered beneath the eyes of Rome. 19,000 condemned men stood among the ships and scaffolds, waiting for a promise they believed had been earned. Mercy. They had done everything expected of them, followed every ritual, even saluted with the old formula that once meant honor. For a breathless moment, the water lay calm, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Then the horns sounded again, notes not of release but of command. The show would continue. Hope, it turned out, was part of the entertainment. To reach this moment, Rome had taken a long road. It did not begin with arenas and emperors. It began at a quiet funeral centuries earlier, when a grieving son turned remembrance into performance. A handful of enslaved men were ordered to honor the dead with a display of courage. It was presented as a duty, as something solemn. The mourners told themselves it was different, that it was not cruelty, but ceremony. Yet something shifted that day. People departed with an energy that did not feel like grief. They spoke about skill, resolve, spectacle. What had been private sorrow became public fascination. Soon, families of status added performances to their funerals. One pair of fighters became two, then three. Words softened the edges: duty, honor, tradition, until the city could admire what it once would have condemned. In the space of a few decades, the custom drifted from home courtyards to public venues. Votes were won with generosity, and generosity was measured in shows. Offices came to require expenses, and expenses found an easy answer: more entertainment. Without writing a single new law, the city taught itself to trade applause for power. Ingenious minds, once devoted to aqueducts and bridges, were drawn into designing stages, seating, moving parts, and timed entrances. Administrators wrote procedures. Artisans perfected scenery. Engineers calculated flow rates, crowd movement, and such. What began as improvisation matured into infrastructure. And with infrastructure came scale. A city that could move hills and redirect rivers could certainly shape an afternoon. The logic felt inescapable. If a small display wins favor, a larger one wins more. If the people enjoy variety, bring new themes, new settings, new history brought to life, the language of mythology and memory became a toolkit. A sacred story could be retold with costumes and music. An ancient battle could be recreated with boats and banners. Accuracy was debated. Choreography was rehearsed. The line between performance and punishment blurred, until it became a single line drawn in sand and water. Along the way, something subtler eroded: the ability to be surprised by cruelty. Not because the acts grew more explicit, though they did, but because the audience learned to anticipate them the way one anticipates the final act of a familiar play. When a city comes to expect a certain kind of ending, it will accept almost any means of reaching it. And on that October day, when the horns called for one more round, the crowd did not stand and leave. They watched, because the story had not yet given them its finale. The crowd did not notice how language had trained them. Words like honor, duty, tradition, and charity softened hard edges, until they sounded almost noble. By the 2nd century before Christ, public office and public spectacle moved in lockstep. Candidates whispered budgets in corridors and announced gifts in the forum. Each promise was measured in seats filled and afternoons consumed. A clever official named Curio dreamed up a marvel: 2 wooden theaters placed back to back, each turning on great pivots. By day they hosted plays. Then, at a signal, they slowly rotated and joined into one vast oval. The people gasped at the transformation: architecture becoming theater, theater becoming arena. It was not simply entertainment. It was proof that the city could bend matter to its will, even the very shape of leisure. Once the city could reconfigure itself for pleasure, it learned to scale pleasure into policy. Engineers were invited to meetings, not to build harbors but to calculate things. Carpenters revised blueprints to hide ropework and hinges from the audience. Administrators drafted timetables with the precision of a campaign, ensuring no lull in sound, no gap in momentum. The point was not merely to show something, but to sustain a feeling: anticipation stretching into relief, then into appetite again. Craft became the quiet partner of control. This new machinery required stories, and history supplied them in abundance. Old battles were rehearsed as living panoramas. Costumes were cut to match ancient illustrations. Banners were painted to replicate lost standards. People who had never seen the sea watched ships appear inside the city, floating on an artificial lake summoned by aqueduct and valve. The illusion was not deception, it was demonstration. Look, the city seemed to say, we can recreate the past to command the present. The lesson landed even for those who did not think of politics. It settled in the body. A breath held as horns rose. A roar released as curtains fell. But there were costs, and they were not only measured in coins or timber. Administrators discovered surprising challenges. Water grew stagnant faster than expected. Platforms swelled and warped beneath sudden loads. Crowd exits narrowed like the neck of a jar when excitement peaked. Manuals appeared. Maintenance cycles were codified. A task force learned how to refresh a lake between morning and afternoon spectacles. If the people applauded a seamless afternoon, it was because a quiet army made it so. Tightening ropes, testing winches, mending seams while the city slept. The backstage acquired its own kind of heroism, uncelebrated, essential, invisible. Philosophers noticed strains in the civic soul. They wrote letters about how a day at the arena made them sharper in speech yet duller in sympathy, more disciplined in posture yet looser in conscience. They confessed a strange fatigue after hours of noise, like a moral muscle held clenched too long. Still, they returned. Everyone returned. The city had perfected a spectacle that promised release. Release that asked for repetition. Repetition that demanded expansion. Each success became a baseline. Each baseline required escalation. And somewhere between rotating theaters and lakes that filled on command, the habit formed that would carry Rome to that October afternoon when a promised ending could be revoked with a flourish, and a day of marvel could become a lesson in how icily hope is rehearsed, staged, and withdrawn. Ambition soon demanded more than clever carpentry or the novelty of turning stages. It demanded permanence. Julius Caesar, eager to outshine rivals, poured treasure into a spectacle no election could ignore. He ordered a vast basin cut into the earth, so wide it rivaled the Forum, so deep it seemed a second city had been hollowed beneath Rome. The plan was audacious: to flood the excavation and stage a naval battle in the heart of the capital. 4,000 men, drawn from prisons and provinces, would play Greeks and Persians in a reenactment of Salamis. They had no choice in their roles, no say in the story they would embody. For Caesar, their labor and their lives were simply raw material for a new kind of legend. The preparations revealed the city's strange priorities. Historians were summoned to ensure the accuracy of the reenactment. Shipwrights built scaled triremes and painted them with authentic colors. Costumers stitched uniforms fit for soldiers long dead. Even as condemned men dug channels for aqueduct water, others rehearsed how to row in formation, how to time a charge, how to fall convincingly when struck. Accuracy mattered, but only in the appearance of things. The underlying truth was simpler. Every oar stroke, every crash of hulls was theater, not history. When the day came, the water glittered, banners waved, and thousands of citizens filled the stands. Horns signaled the start. The fleets advanced, their wooden prows splitting waves that only weeks before had been dry soil. At first, the scene unfolded as intended. The Persians attacked, the Greeks feigned retreat, the crowd gasped at the choreography, but order soon dissolved into chaos. Ships crashed off script, men shouted not lines but desperate pleas, and the water churned into confusion. The audience, however, did not mind. They roared louder, thrilled by the unpredictability. Authenticity had given way to spectacle, and spectacle was enough. From that day, something shifted in the empire's imagination. If one leader could stage the sea itself, another could outdo him with grander designs. Augustus built arenas meant to last centuries, with aqueducts feeding basins deep enough to hold dozens of vessels. Engineers measured water levels with the same precision once reserved for temples. Drainage systems were devised to empty the basin between morning and evening shows, ensuring the city could consume its performances in endless cycles. Records describe how workers tested water quality, how they calculated depths that balanced the drama of risk with the practical need of retrieval. Rome's genius for order had found a new domain, the orchestration of death as civic rhythm. Yet beneath the surface ran disquiet. Some senators grumbled that the Republic had exchanged law for amusement, that politics itself now revolved around seating charts and ticket distributions. Philosophers wrote of leaving the arena with minds clouded, appetites sharpened, empathy dulled. But their words circulated like whispers at a feast, quickly acknowledged, quickly ignored. The people wanted more, and those in power had learned a truth they would never relinquish. Nothing bound citizens together so tightly as shared spectacle. Bread filled bellies, but the roar of the crowd filled something deeper, the sense of being part of an empire that could turn even memory, even myth, into performance. By the reign of Augustus, the machinery of entertainment had become indistinguishable from the machinery of empire. What once required improvisation now relied on permanent infrastructure. The amphitheater was no longer a temporary structure of wood and rope. It was stone, marble, and concrete, designed to last as long as Rome itself. Its arches framed not just entrances but symbols of endurance, declaring that the empire's pleasures, like its power, were meant to be eternal. Beneath the sand stretched hidden corridors, storage chambers, lifts, and pulleys. The true marvel of Roman engineering was not the soaring walls above, but the labyrinth below, an unseen city that fed the appetite of the crowd. Here slaves and laborers toiled unseen, hauling scenery, raising platforms, and preparing animals. Logs describe the rhythm of their work, adjusting mechanisms when gears clogged, draining water after naval reenactments, checking ropes that strained under sudden weight. They lived in perpetual twilight, hearing but not seeing the spectacles above. For them, the roar of the crowd was not applause, but a signal time to pull the lever, release the gate, or lower the lift. They were stagehands in a drama they could never watch, participants in a machine that consumed lives as easily as it consumed timber and stone. For the spectators above, the system worked flawlessly. At a signal, an exotic animal appeared as if from nowhere. At another, Scenery rose from the earth to transform the stage. The precision of these illusions dazzled the audience, who marveled not only at what they saw, but at Rome's ability to command nature itself. Water flowed in and out of the basin on cue. Entire forests could be raised, only to vanish minutes later. The ground itself seemed alive, a servant to imperial will. But with each advance came new expectations. Crowds who once marveled at a single contest now demanded dozens in a single afternoon. What had thrilled one generation became routine for the next. The hunger for novelty pressed emperors to outdo their predecessors. To disappoint was to invite ridicule. To innovate was to secure loyalty. Thus the cycle tightened. Greater shows required greater resources. Greater resources demanded greater ambition, and ambition itself became bound to blood and applause. Politics and performance merged until they were indistinguishable. Even the myths of old were not safe. Legends once told to teach courage or compassion were repurposed as scripts for staged finales. Heroes of poetry were recast as roles for the condemned. Where children had once learned that music soothed wild beasts, they now saw music fail, rewritten before their eyes. The lesson was not that virtue triumphed, but that no virtue could stand against Rome's appetite. Meaning itself was put on trial, and the verdict was decided by the crowd. Some observers recognized the danger. Writers recorded their unease, confessing how each visit left them a little more restless, a little more callous, a little less themselves. Yet still they attended. Rome had discovered a truth both intoxicating and corrosive. Shared spectacle could unite a people more powerfully than shared belief. In the shadow of the amphitheater, philosophy faltered, tradition bent, and even conscience grew quiet. What mattered most was not justice, nor truth, but continuity of the performance. And as long as the crowd roared, the machine would keep turning. By the time of Claudius and Nero, the appetite for wonder had reached its peak. No longer content with ordinary contests, emperors demanded shows that blurred the line between history, legend, and nightmare. Vast basins filled with water to stage naval battles. Entire landscapes rose from hidden chambers. Myths were retold not as lessons but as cautionary performances where even beauty and music could not triumph. The city itself had become a stage, its rulers playwrights, its citizens both actors and audience in dramas where endings were always the same. The cruelty was not always in the act itself, but in the betrayal of expectation. Promises of mercy dangled before thousands only to be revoked at the sound of a horn. The people cheered, not because they approved of the deception, but because they were caught in the momentum of spectacle, unable to step outside it. Rome had transformed obedience, hope, and even despair into tools for entertainment. In the process, it revealed a truth both unsettling and enduring. Once a society teaches itself to take pleasure in suffering, it will always find new ways to stage it. Philosophers like Seneca wrote about the corruption that seeped into their own hearts. They confessed how an afternoon at the games left them sharper in wit but emptier in compassion, more ambitious yet strangely hollow. They saw children in the stands, learning to equate applause with cruelty, excitement with annihilation. They warned that values inverted so thoroughly would erode the foundations of the empire itself. Yet even they kept attending. Curiosity, habit, and the pull of the crowd proved stronger than conscience. For the rulers, spectacle became a tool of control more effective than law. To gather tens of thousands in one place, to make them roar as a single voice, was to remind them of their unity under the emperor's gaze. Distraction dulled dissent. Shared excitement disguised inequality. The arena promised belonging, and belonging demanded silence. In the shadows, some began to ask what happened when no spectacle could satisfy anymore, when the scale of wonder became so vast that nothing seemed enough. Those questions echoed in private letters, but they did not reach the Senate floor. The cycle continued, and so it was that 19,000 men found themselves in a flooded arena, believing they had earned life only to discover they were part of the finale. Their obedience, their ritual words, their exhaustion, none of it mattered in the face of the greater drama. They became symbols, erased as individuals, remembered only as a number in imperial records. The crowd left subdued, not because they regretted what they had witnessed, but because the show had forced them to stare into the mirror of their own appetite. Centuries later, we read of these spectacles with disbelief, shaking our heads at a civilization that could turn human suffering into routine entertainment. Yet the warning endures. The arena may have changed its shape, the stage may now be digital, but the temptation remains the same. To consume the pain of others as diversion, to forget that behind every performance lies a person with a name, a history, a life. Rome's greatest lesson is not its architecture or its conquests, but its reminder that once entertainment becomes more valuable than humanity, mercy itself turns into theater. And in that theater, no one is truly safe, not the condemned, not the crowd, not even the empire that applauds.